Here's a number, 0.254. Doesn't look like much, 4 digits, a value you'd barely glance at on a spreadsheet. But that number killed a dynasty, ended a bloodline, and destroyed a human body so thoroughly that the man it belonged to couldn't walk until he was 8 years old, couldn't chew his own food, and died at 38, looking like an old man. That number is the inbreeding coefficient of Charles II of Spain, the last king produced by a German family so obsessed with keeping power inside its own bloodline that it mathematically engineered its own extinction. If Charles II's parents had been brother and sister, full biological siblings, same mother, same father, his coefficient would have been 0.25, lower than what he got. His parents weren't siblings. They were uncle and niece. And yet 2 centuries of accumulated marriages within one German-Austrian dynasty pushed their son past a threshold that a single generation of sibling incest can't reach on its own. The Habsburgs, a family that climbed out of a minor castle in what is now Switzerland, seized the Holy Roman Empire, and became the most powerful house in German history, didn't need an enemy to end their line. They had arithmetic, and the arithmetic was merciless. If you've been following this series, you know the broad strokes already. The jaw, the tongue, the autopsy we covered last time. You know how the story ends. What you don't know, what almost nobody understands, is the math that made it inevitable. That's what this episode is. Not anecdotes, not grotesque descriptions. Numbers. Because the numbers tell the horror story better than any narrative ever could. So before we touch a single Hapsburg, we need to understand what an inbreeding coefficient actually is, what it measures, and why it matters. This part isn't optional. If you don't get this, everything that follows is just digits on a screen. In 1922, an American geneticist named Sewell Wright introduced a metric he called the coefficient of inbreeding, represented by the letter F. What F measures is deceptively simple: the probability that the 2 copies of any given gene in your body are not just similar, not just doing the same job, but are literally the same piece of DNA, inherited from the same ancestor, traveling down 2 different branches of your family tree, and colliding in you. The technical term is identical by descent. Every human carries 2 copies of every gene, one from mom, one from dad. If your parents are completely unrelated, no shared ancestry whatsoever going back as far as records reach, then F equals 0. 0 probability that any of your gene pairs are duplicates of each other. Your genetic deck was shuffled from 2 completely separate stacks. Now flip it. Brother and sister, same 2 parents. When they have a child, that child's F is 0.25. At any randomly chosen gene in that child's genome, there's a 1 in 4 chance both copies are identical by descent. Carbon copies of the same ancestral gene, arriving through 2 routes at once. Parent and child produce the same value, 0.25. That's the ceiling for a single generation of first-degree incest, assuming the parents themselves aren't already inbred. Between 0 and 0.25, a whole ladder exists. Second cousins produce offspring at roughly 0.0156. First cousins, about 0.0625. Uncle and niece, or half-siblings, approximately 0.125. Each rung measures how tightly a family tree has folded in on itself. But why does folding matter? Why does the number do anything at all to a living body? Here's what most people never think about. You, right now, wherever you are carrying broken genes. Everyone is. Population geneticists estimate the average person harbors between 1 and 2 lethal recessive mutations, plus dozens of mildly damaging ones. A whole library of quiet errors scattered across your genome. And not a single one of them hurts you. Because for each broken copy, You've got a working copy right beside it, inherited from your other parent, doing the job just fine. One good copy is enough. The broken one stays silent, invisible, masked. Think of it like a pair of headphones. Left earbud works great. Right earbud's busted. You can still hear the music, no problem. But if both earbuds are broken, same defect, same gene, two copies of the same malfunction, silence. The gene fails. The protein it was supposed to make never gets made, or gets made wrong. And depending on what that protein does, the consequences range from something you'd never notice to something that kills you before your first birthday. Two copies of the same broken gene. That's the phrase. Remember it. It's the engine of everything that follows. When unrelated people have children, the odds that both parents carry a broken copy of the exact same gene in the exact same spot are astronomically low. Their errors are in different places, covering each other across the whole genome like a safety net woven from two completely different patterns. But when relatives have children, they share ancestors, they share DNA, and they share the broken bits that came from those ancestors. The closer the relatives, the more overlap. The more overlap, the higher the chance a child inherits two copies of the same broken gene with no working backup anywhere in their cells. That's what F quantifies, not an abstraction. Risk. Real, calculable, compounding risk. And the word compounding is doing the heaviest lifting in that sentence, because what the Habsburgs did wasn't one bad marriage, it was compound interest on genetic debt. Every number that follows comes from a single source, and its credibility matters, because if you don't trust the math, nothing else lands. In April 2009, Gonzalo Alvarez, Francisco C. Ceballos, and Celsa Quintero of the University of Santiago de Compostela published The Role of Inbreeding in the Extinction of a European Royal Dynasty in the journal PLOS 1. Their dataset was extraordinary. A genealogical pedigree of more than 3,000 individuals connected to the Habsburg dynasty across 16 generations. 16 generations. That depth matters enormously. A calculation using only 3 or 4 generations of ancestry will miss paths of shared relationship that trace through more distant common ancestors, underestimating the true coefficient. By going back 16 generations, Alvarez and his colleagues captured every consanguineous loop, every redundant ancestor, every folded branch of a family tree that should have spread outward, but instead curled back in on itself. No published rebuttal has overturned the findings. Ceballos and Alvarez published follow-up work in Heredity in 2013, expanding the analysis. A 2019 study confirmed that the famous Hapsburg jaw, mandibular prognathism, correlates directly with inbreeding coefficients measured from the same dataset. The value of 0.254 for Charles II has entered genetics textbooks. It's been cited in medical journals, university courses, and peer-reviewed research for over 15 years. The number is as solid as historical genetics gets. Now, let's watch it climb. The House of Hapsburg takes its name from a castle, Hapsburg, or Habsburg, the Hawk's Castle, built around 1020 in what is now the canton of Aargau in Switzerland, right at the edge of the German-speaking world. For centuries, the Habsburgs were a minor German-speaking nobility, accumulating territory through marriage, inheritance, and sheer persistence across the lands of the Holy Roman Empire. By the late 15th century, they'd clawed their way to the top, the imperial crown itself, the seat of German power, held almost continuously by Habsburg men. This was a German dynasty in its bones, German language, German lands, German ambitions, that would eventually reach so far beyond Germany that it ruled half of Europe. And the genetic catastrophe that destroyed it was, at every stage, driven by the strategic logic of keeping that sprawling German empire stitched together through marriage. The Spanish line begins with Philip I, Philip the Handsome, born in 1478 to Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I and Mary of Burgundy. The Habsburg and Burgundian houses had already intermarried enough in prior generations that Philip entered the world carrying an inbreeding coefficient of 0.025. Small, roughly equivalent to the child of second cousins, a background hum of shared ancestry common across German and Austrian aristocracy in the 15th century. Nothing alarming. This number is the starting line. Remember it. Philip married Joanna of Castile in 1496, and genetically, this was actually good news. Joanna was a daughter of Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, the monarchs who'd unified Spain. Her Trastamara bloodline was relatively unrelated to the German-Austrian Hapsburg line. Fresh DNA from an entirely different corner of Europe. When their son Charles was born in 1500, the future Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, ruler of the largest domain any European monarch had ever commanded, his F value actually dropped. 0.0156, lower than his father's. Joanna had introduced enough new genetic material to push the number down. This is the moment the dynasty stood at a crossroads, though no one alive understood it in those terms. If the Habsburgs had kept marrying outside their bloodline, the coefficient could have kept falling. Generation after generation of genetic diversification, the safety net growing wider and thicker with every new union. They did the opposite. The reasons were geographic, political, and strategic, never genetic. By the mid-16th century, the Habsburg Empire was staggering in scope. Spain and its American colonies, the Netherlands, large parts of Italy, Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, and the vast patchwork of German principalities over which the Holy Roman Emperor held nominal authority. The family's overriding imperative was to keep these territories bound together, and the most reliable mechanism was marriage. A Habsburg archduchess sent from Vienna to marry a French prince was a potential territory lost. That same archduchess, married to her Spanish Habsburg cousin, was an alliance cemented, a border secured, a crown retained. The Austrian branch of the family and the Spanish branch functioned as two arms of the same body, and they kept reaching across Europe to clasp hands with each other, generation after generation, in marriage after marriage, that sent the same German-Austrian DNA shuttling back and forth across the continent. Smart politics. Devastating biology. Charles V made the first fateful move. In 1526, he married Isabella of Portugal. Sounds like outbreeding, doesn't it? Portuguese, not Habsburg. But Isabella's mother was Maria of Aragon, a daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. The same Ferdinand and Isabella who were Charles V's own maternal grandparents through Joanna. Charles and Isabella were first cousins. Their shared grandparents occupied two positions on their son's family tree simultaneously, and the genetic material those grandparents carried had two separate chances to arrive at the same destination. Philip II, born in 1527. Inbreeding coefficient? 0.0295, nearly double his father's value. Still modest by the standards of what was coming, but the curve had begun to bend upward, and it would not bend back down for long. Philip II became one of the most powerful monarchs in European history, ruling Spain and its empire for over 40 years from the vast gray palace of El Escorial. He married 4 times: Maria Manuela of Portugal, Mary I of England, Elizabeth of Valois, and finally, in 1570, the marriage that detonated the genetic trajectory of the entire dynasty. Her name was Anna of Austria. She was his niece, but uncle married niece doesn't begin to capture the density of their genetic overlap. Anna's mother, Maria, was Philip II's own sister, sent from Spain to Vienna to marry their cousin, Maximilian II, Holy Roman Emperor, as part of the endless Austrian-Spanish Habsburg exchange program. So, Anna was Philip's niece through his sister, but Maximilian II, Anna's father, was himself a son of Ferdinand I, Charles V's brother, making Maximilian and Philip first cousins as well. Anna's parents were first cousins who'd married each other. She was already the product of a consanguineous union before she married her uncle. The genetic paths connecting Philip II and Anna of Austria weren't a single thread. They were a web. Multiple routes through the pedigree, hitting the same German-Austrian ancestors again and again and again. Their son, Philip III, born in 1578, registered the most dramatic single-generation jump in the entire Spanish Habsburg lineage. His inbreeding coefficient? 0.218. Absorb that. An almost 8-fold leap from his father's 0.0295 in one generation. 0.218 is not far below the 0.25 ceiling for sibling incest offspring. And Philip III's parents weren't siblings. They were uncle and niece, a relationship that in isolation should produce offspring at 0.125. But because this particular uncle and this particular niece were themselves products of the deeply intermarried Austrian-Spanish Hapsburg web, the actual coefficient shattered the expected value by nearly 75%. Philip III, by most accounts, got lucky. He was a functional monarch, passive, pious, content to let his favorite, the Duke of Lerma, handle governance. He wasn't visibly ravaged by genetic disease. This is a crucial point that the math demands honesty about. A high inbreeding coefficient doesn't guarantee catastrophe at the individual level. It increases probability. It loads the gun. But probability isn't certainty, and Philip III appears to have dodged bullets his genome was saturated with. The recessive alleles were there, lurking in single copies behind working partners. They just hadn't found their matches yet. Not all of them. Not yet. Then the number dipped, and this is the cruelest part of the entire dataset. Philip III married Margaret of Austria in 1599. Margaret was a Hapsburg, yes, daughter of Archduke Charles II of Inner Austria and Maria Anna of Bavaria. But her particular branch of the Austrian family had intermarried somewhat less intensively with the Spanish line in recent generations. Enough fresh genetic input to pull the number down. Their son, Philip IV, born in 1605, had an inbreeding coefficient of 0.115. The number dropped. The family tree briefly exhaled. If Philip IV had married outside the Habsburg bloodline entirely, a French princess, a Savoy duchess, anyone whose ancestry didn't loop back into the same tangled German-Austrian web, the coefficient for the next generation could have fallen further. The genetic trajectory could have reversed. The dynasty might have pulled itself back from the edge. This was a real possibility. The data shows it. The math allowed for it. Philip IV married his niece. His first wife, Elizabeth of France, wasn't closely related to him and bore him several children. But his only surviving son from that marriage, Baltasar Carlos, the heir Spain had pinned everything on, died in 1646 at just 16 years old. Desperate for a male heir, Philip IV reached back across to the Austrian branch one final time. His bride? Mariana of Austria. Mariana's mother was Maria Anna of Spain. Maria Anna was Philip IV's own sister, sent to Vienna in the eternal Hapsburg exchange, married to Ferdinand III, Holy Roman Emperor. Mariana was therefore Philip IV's niece. She was 15 years old. He was 44. And the genetic mathematics of this union were catastrophic in a way that no single relationship label can capture. because calling it an uncle-niece marriage implies an expected coefficient of 0.125 for the offspring. That expectation assumes the uncle and niece are otherwise unrelated. These two were anything but. Philip IV's own F was 0.115. Mariana's was similarly elevated. Her parents, Ferdinand III and Maria Anna, were first cousins, both from deeply intermarried Habsburg stock. When uncle married niece, with both carrying genomes already drenched in overlapping German-Austrian ancestry, the compounding effect didn't just add, it multiplied. Charles II was born on November 6, 1661. His inbreeding coefficient, computed by Alvarez, Ceballos, and Quintero, using the full 16-generation pedigree of more than 3,000 individuals, 0.254. Let that sit for a moment. Don't rush past it. 0.254. The child of a brother and sister. The most extreme single-generation incest between first-degree relatives scores 0.25. Charles II exceeded it. Not because his parents were siblings, they weren't, but because every consanguineous marriage in the preceding 2 centuries, every strategic union between the Austrian and Spanish branches of this German dynasty, had layered shared ancestry on top of shared ancestry on top of shared ancestry, until the cumulative weight pushed past a ceiling that one generation of sibling incest can't breach alone. The mechanism has a name: pedigree collapse, and Charles II's family tree is its most extreme documented example. A normal, non-inbred person has 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16 great-great-grandparents, 32 at the 5th generation back, each position occupied by a unique individual. The tree fans outward, wider with every generation. Charles II's tree doesn't fan. It loops. His mother, Mariana of Austria, was also his first cousin once removed. His father was simultaneously his great-uncle, Joanna of Castile, who'd married Philip the Handsome way back in 1496, appears through multiple independent paths, the same woman occupying several positions on the tree simultaneously. Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain show up so many times, through so many roots, that their genetic contribution to Charles was massively outsized, compared to what any single ancestor contributes in a normal pedigree. Where the tree should have widened, it narrowed. Where it should have introduced new genetic material from new families, new bloodlines, new corners of Europe, it recycled the same German-Austrian DNA. The tree folded inward until it wasn't a tree at all, but a series of concentric loops, each one a consanguineous marriage, sending the same ancestral genes down converging paths toward the same body. And that body broke. Researchers analyzing Charles II's extensively documented symptoms have identified 2 autosomal recessive conditions that, taken together, explain nearly everything recorded about his suffering: combined pituitary hormone deficiency and distal renal tubular acidosis. Both are autosomal recessive disorders, caused by inheriting 2 copies of the same broken gene. The exact mechanism the inbreeding coefficient predicts, the exact scenario that an F of 0.254 makes terrifyingly probable across thousands of gene loci simultaneously. Combined pituitary hormone deficiency, CPHD, means the pituitary gland fails to produce adequate levels of multiple critical hormones at once: growth hormone, thyroid-stimulating hormone, gonadotropins, the hormones that drive sexual development and fertility. Strip those away from a developing body, and here's what you get: short stature, because the bones never received the chemical signals telling them to grow; delayed puberty, or puberty that barely arrives at all. Muscle weakness. Profound, disabling muscle weakness. The kind that meant Charles couldn't walk until he was 8 years old, 4 or 5 years after most children are running. Cognitive impairment. And infertility. Total, irreversible infertility. The most powerful monarchy in Europe, the throne that commanded Spain and its American colonies and half the Mediterranean, had no heir and no biological possibility of producing one. The pituitary gland, a structure the size of a pea sitting at the base of the brain, had been sabotaged by 2 copies of the same broken gene, and it took the entire dynasty down with it. Distal renal tubular acidosis, DRTA, attacks from a completely different angle. This is a kidney disorder. The kidneys lose the ability to properly acidify urine, which sounds minor until you understand the cascade it triggers. Chronic metabolic acidosis sets in. The blood becomes too acidic, persistently, relentlessly. Muscles weaken further, compounding the damage already done by CPHD. Bones soften. In children, it manifests as rickets. In adults, osteomalacia. Kidney stones form. Blood appears in the urine. Nausea. Vomiting. A fatigue so crushing it pins you to the bed. The body slowly poisoning itself because the kidneys can't perform the basic chemical housekeeping that every healthy body manages without conscious effort, every hour of every day. Stack these 2 conditions in the same person, CPHD destroying the hormonal architecture, DRTA dissolving the metabolic foundation. Layer them on top of each other in a body that was already compromised at conception, where 25.4% of gene pairs were identical by descent, where the safety net had been stripped away at locus after locus after locus. You get Charles II of Spain, a king who couldn't walk until age 8, who couldn't chew his food because his jaw was so deformed, the famous Habsburg mandibular prognathism that the 2019 follow-up study confirmed correlates directly with inbreeding coefficients, who drooled constantly because his tongue was too large for his mouth, who suffered seizures, who looked elderly in his 30s, a man aging at twice the normal rate, who was impotent and infertile, the dead end of a dynasty that had ruled half of Europe. Not because of one unlucky marriage, not because of some random misfortune, because of arithmetic, because of 6 data points climbing across 6 generations, 0.025, 0.0156, 0.0295, 0.218, 0.115, 0.254. Each one the product of a marriage contract written in a German chancery or a Spanish palace, signed by diplomats who understood territory and alliance and succession, but had no concept of the invisible genetic equation each signature also executed. Every uncle-niece match, every cousin pairing, every bride shipped between Vienna and Madrid in the endless Hapsburg exchange. Each one was a calculation. And each calculation compounded the damage from every calculation before it. Lay those 6 numbers out in sequence, and they tell you everything. The modest beginning, 0.025, just background noise. The brief reprieve, 0.0156, when Joanna of Castile's Trastamara blood diluted the Hapsburg concentration. The first turn upward, 0.0295, when Charles V married his Portuguese first cousin. The explosion, 0.218, when Philip II married his niece Anna of Austria, and the Austrian-Spanish feedback loop hit critical mass. The false hope, 0.115, when Margaret of Austria's slightly less entangled branch brought the number back down, when the dynasty could still have saved itself. And the final irreversible answer, 0.254, when Philip IV married his own niece, and the compounding of 2 centuries of shared ancestry produced a coefficient that exceeded the theoretical maximum for sibling incest. That sequence is the dramatic arc. Not a battle, not a political crisis, not a succession dispute. 6 numbers climbing, and a dynasty dying inside them. Charles II died on November 1st, 1700. He was 38. No children, no heir. The Spanish Hapsburg line, the line that had begun when a German dynasty sent Philip the Handsome to marry a Castilian princess in 1496, ended in a body that could barely sustain itself, let alone produce an heir. 2 centuries of dynastic engineering, every marriage contract designed to preserve the family's grip on thrones from Madrid to Vienna, had instead produced the family's extinction. The marriages meant to strengthen the bloodline had, gene by gene, generation by generation, equation by equation, destroyed it. The dynasty didn't fall to war, didn't fall to revolution, didn't fall to a rival house's armies or a people's uprising. It fell to a number that crept upward 0.025, 0.0156, 0.0295, 0.218, 0.115. Patient, indifferent, following the math wherever the marriage contracts led until it reached 0.254 and a body couldn't sustain it anymore. Until 2 copies of the same broken gene met in cell after cell after cell, and no working backup existed anywhere. And the pituitary failed, and the kidneys failed, and the jaw warped, and the muscles wasted, and the most powerful bloodline in European history ended in a man who couldn't chew his own food. The math was always the villain. The math was always the story. If this is the kind of deep dive that changes how you see history, subscribe. More episodes are coming.